Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. The Bevan Foundation is a Welsh think tank that seeks to create a fair, prosperous and sustainable Wales for all by strengthening public policy. As part of their work, they have recently published a report about the current housing crisis, which is affecting urban centres as well as rural communities. Joining us today, we've got Steph Evans, Head of Policy Leading on Poverty for the Bevan Foundation. Hello, Steph.
Hello, hiya.
Hello there. And we've got Hugh Cosan, who is the Housing Policy Officer for the Bevan Foundation. Hello, Hugh.
Hi.
So before we start about the report, it's important for our listeners to understand one of the key concepts that you focus on, the local housing allowance, or the LHA. Would one of you be able to explain what this is, how it works, and who is responsible for delivering it?
Local housing allowance is to put it simply, the means of which someone's housing entitlement is calculated if they live in the private rental sector. So if you are claiming housing benefit or the housing element of universal credit, and you live in the private rental sector, your benefits in that regard are calculated by the local housing allowance. And this is legislated by the Department of Work and Pensions and the UK government. The allocation changes depending on a number of different factors. So how many bedrooms a person requires, so that depends on their age, how many dependents they have, the age of those dependents as well, but also the area that they live in. And these areas are referred to as BRMAs, broad rental market areas. I'll just say market areas because it's a mouthful otherwise. The LHA is designed to allow someone to afford to rent a house in the cheapest 30% of a given market area. So the 30 percentile, as it's often referred to.
So the LHA has undergone reforms recently. Would you be able to explain why this is contributing to the housing crisis in the private rental sector?
The LHA has undergone a lot of different reforms over since its introduction. Most recently it was frozen in the end of 2020-2021 period. The decision to freeze it was made at the end of 2020 for the following financial year, meaning that for this financial year and the next financial year, the rates are going to be set at the 30 percentile back in 2020. So the LHA as it stands now is based on rents that were relevant 2 years ago rather than rents now. And as I imagine you've probably seen in the news quite recently, or over the past couple of years, rents have gone up quite significantly over the pandemic years. The LHA that we have now is quite distant from the LHA or from the rental markets that existed 2 years ago when the rates were uplifted again. And we know this is quite likely a bad thing because the rents, this is the second time that the LHA has been frozen. It was frozen between 2016 and 2020. And in that time, there's a fair amount of research that directly links this freeze to a rise in housing insecurity and a rise of homelessness. And so we are more at the start of that freeze in comparison just to the effects that were at the end of the previous freeze, but we are beginning to see the sort of same distance that's occurring between the same gap emerging between the LHA and market rents. There are signs that indicate that those households are feeling the same sort of financial pressure that they did during the previous freeze.
That gap is really significant. So the gap that he was talking about there is really significant, but because what it means is that people don't have enough money through their benefits to cover their rent. If that happens to you, what that means is that you either have to cut back, on other things. And at the moment, we're hearing a lot about the cost of living. We're hearing a lot about the cost of gas, electric. We're not hearing a lot about the cost of housing in the same way. And, this is all adding to the pressure families are facing. Or, of course, you end up moving into poorer quality housing because that's what you can afford, or you're pushed into homelessness. And I think the scale of the problem has been really highlighted in the report published today, where we found that the LHA, as Hugh said, should cover 30% of rents, but actually in practice, it covers about 3.8% of rents that were advertised in 10 Welsh local authorities in the 10 that we looked at between May and December last year. So it's a big gap. It's nowhere near enough, and it's putting real squeeze on families.
Obviously, you talked about the BRMA a little bit before, Hugh, but would you be able to go into a little bit more depth about that? So obviously, rental costs vary quite widely across the country. This is the method by which the LHA absorbs these variations, right?
Yeah, so the BRMAs are, it's an area in which someone can easily access different facilities. So there's a list of different facilities such as shopping, healthcare, education, recreation. The boundary zone area are set so that anyone within that area should reasonably be expected to get to different parts of the area and access those facilities. You know, if you've got the middle of Snowdonia in between a local authority, they'll split the local authority up into different BRMAs, or for the different geographical landmarks or boundaries, they'll put those BRMAs in place. Now, there is a problem with the way that they set the BRMAs is that in that they do often encompass quite varied rental markets within them. So the example I use all the time is Torvine BRMA, which roughly mirrors the local authority boundaries. Now, with Torvine, you've got quite a more affluent market in the south in Cambran, where you've got more of a middle-class professional market, whereas up in the north of Torvine, you've got Blaenavon, which is a lot less affluent. But because it is one BRMA, and because you can sort of access different facilities equally easy, regardless if you're in the north or the south, then it's one BRMA. What this means is that you have two quite distinct market areas within this BRMA, which then influences the overall LHA for the area. So if, you know, it may be more accessible to live in Blaenavon, but if your local, you know, if your family or your friends or your support network in Cambran, the LHA is quite often not going to be sufficient to allow you to rent in that area because it's weighted because of the Blaenavon rents.
I think it's just one thing to add on that as well is that because of the LHA freeze, but also kind of more broadly because of the way this data is collected. So as Hugh said, the LHA is set by BRMA, it's set by bedroom size. There isn't an awful lot of shared accommodation or one bed homes in a lot of these areas. So that means that you end up having kind of shared accommodation from a neighbouring authority of neighbouring BRMA being used to determine rents in another area, which, you know, is not particularly representative kind of what's going on. And there's further data issues around that as well, which might be able to come on to touch on. But because of all those issues, even in areas where historically might have benefited from this distortion, kind of what's going on in the market. So, you know, if you lived in Blaenavon, your family's from Blaenavon, you might have benefited and be more likely to find a property you can rent that is covered by benefits. The gap is now getting so big that even in those areas, the LHA is not enough to cover rents in many circumstances. So, you know, even in areas that have historically benefited from this kind of distortion of the way it's done, and now really struggling as well. So it is a completely pan-Wales problem that we're finding.
I'm going to draw two of these things together you've talked about, Steph. So you've talked about the gap between the LHA and the rents and data being important. How did you get the data to examine this question?
So Hugh did a lot of the donkey work on this, to be fair to him. So what we've done is looked at properties that were advertised on the rental market between May and December last year in 10 Welsh local authorities. So use websites such as Rightmove, for example, took all that data off the website, and then we've tried to work out how those rents compare to LHA rates. Now, it's important to note that because we're taking the websites off information off the website, we're looking at advertised rents, whereas the LHA is set based on actual rents. So what that means is the rents agreed between landlords and tenants. So there is a difference. But what we were looking at then is kind of, if you were looking for a house last summer in one of these 10 local authorities and you were on a low income, what was available for you? And the answer was not a lot.
Because often when in competitive markets, you'll get situations where people get into bidding wars with each other, and actually that could push the price up further still, right?
Absolutely, and that's something we heard from. We spoke to a lot of local authority officers across Wales, and indeed people with experience of using the system. And one of the things that we were hearing over and over again from local authority officers were that they had never seen a rental market like it that they were seeing last year. That houses were going up super quickly, properties were vanishing, and people were actually competing with each other to rent. Whereas in the past, you know, people were able to maybe kind of take rent at the advertised value or even a little bit below. Now it's actually, if anything, the distortion is the other way.
Beyond the crazy housing market, why does this gap exist between the LHAs and the rent prices? Hugh, I don't know if you wanted to deal with this.
Sure. I suppose one would be the freeze. I think that's quite a significant a policy decision that's led to the LHA gap that we're seeing. It's something that's widely acknowledged. It's something that's been widely researched in the past. That when you have this freeze and it doesn't increase, you're going to see a gap, and it's going to impact households. But one of the other core findings from our research is that, Stefan mentioned it before, the quality of the data that the LHA is set from is not where it should be. So the LHA itself is set by rent officers who collect data from landlords directly in different local authorities. And what they do is they create a big list of all the different rents in a given area, and they find the 30th percentile from that. What we found, though, is that the data set that they're using to calculate the LHA is often quite insufficient for the purposes that they're trying to do. So, as Stefan mentioned, you have some areas where you have very low amounts of shared accommodation, or some areas where there's very low amounts of 4-bedroom properties. And so, what they often do is they take data from other areas in Wales and try to apply it to other areas where the data may be lower. So, you're trying to take data that may not be particularly relevant for the context and trying to apply it in that particular area. But what we also found is that we heard from quite a few local authority officers that landlords at the higher end of the market, those who are trying to attract a more middle class or professional market and have no real interest in the LHA, because the data is collected manually, they have no incentive to submit that data. The process is essentially rent officers go up to landlords and letting agents and say, can you please give us this data? And if they can't be bothered, then it doesn't get collected. So what we found is that those landlords at the top end of the market are not submitting the data because they have no need to, because they're not affected by the LHA. So the data set that rent officers are using immediately is weighted towards the lower end of the market because they're the people who are more influenced by the LHA. But added to that, there's also a lot of caveats involved for what data they can actually use. And a big one is they can't actually use properties that already have someone who's in receipt of benefits, and they can't use that in the data set. And this wipes out a huge portion of the rental market and the data that they actually can use. So what we're left is what we regard as very insufficient for setting the LHA. And it is quite likely that the LHA that is created from this data set is very unlikely to be an accurate representation of the market area, and the 30% of that comes from that is probably wide the mark in terms of providing support. So not only is the data insufficient, but also we have this data set that we don't really know, is it representative? Is it a good sample size? We just don't know. And that's one of our recommendations, is to make the data collection of these rents be mandatory, so landlords have to submit it. So we can say with certainty that this is the rental market picture. These are the rents that are within Wales and within each BRMA. This is the 30th percentile. Is it sufficient? If yes, then fantastic. If no, then we can reevaluate the LHA then.
Well, one thing you often hear horror stories of is people in receipt of universal credit specifically not being allowed to rent in the private rental sector. Did you encounter much of that when you were doing the research for this project, and how bad do you think that situation still is for people?
I think it was mentioned by virtually everyone that we spoke to. So we did a lot of research, speaking to people with lived experience of trying to rent while claiming housing benefit or universal credit, and virtually all of them said, they would go to a landlord or letting agent and say, I'd like to rent your property, and as soon as the word benefits or welfare came up, it's they were dropped. It's either some cases it was very overt, saying, I don't want someone with benefits. Other times it was just like, there's too much demand, we'll keep you on our waiting list, and they just never hear back. And certainly what we're seeing as well is that there are a huge swathe of barriers that are in place that I suppose do the job of landlords denying people for them. So quite often you have large deposits. What we found were quite a few properties had deposits in excess of 1 month's equivalent of rent, meaning that you have to fork out huge amounts of money just to get into the property in the first place, which in many instances someone with low income just doesn't have. But also we saw quite a lot of guarantor requirements. And in particular, guarantors was something that local authorities identified as being on the increase ever since the ruling to ban no DSS within adverts came in 2020. From our point of view, we did see a lot of discrimination against people in receipt of benefits, either overtly through just the actions of the landlords just blocking them completely, or through these barriers that were introduced. And oftentimes it is, a lot of it is based in stigma towards these tenants, either through fear that they won't pay on time or for fear that there may be antisocial behaviour. But also what we saw is that frequently, if you're a buy-to-let landlord, the mortgage conditions of your that you bought property with often stipulate things like the tenant must have a minimum income, which will be above what they'll receive through universal credit, or they aren't allowed to rent out to people in benefits full stop. So there's a lot of different factors there that are preventing people on low income from being able to rent in the first place. And what we found is that when you take the properties that are fully covered by the LHA and subtract the ones with these kinds of restrictions, what you're left with is about 2.1% of the advertised market actually being available for people on housing benefit, which is insanely small amount of the market that's actually on offer. And virtually everyone that we spoke to was affected by one or two or multiple of these restrictions.
And I think, again, that feeds into the idea, of people being pushed into properties then, and the impact that has on people as well who are in accommodation. So there's this fear that if I speak up, I know how difficult it is going to be to find somewhere else. So I will put up with the fact that my landlord hasn't fixed the leaking roof for a few months. There's that sort of impact as well. And also, all of these requirements are trapping people within the homelessness system. So one of the other things we heard as well is that if a support worker from a homelessness shelter or something like that called up a landlord, the person they were supporting was now ready to move into permanent accommodation by themselves. They were ready to take on that tenancy, but as soon as they'd heard that someone had help from the Home Guard or someone like that, they wouldn't be interested. So it's trapping people within, the homelessness system, and putting extra pressure on public services as well, who aren't able to move people on so that we can support other people who need that help.
Steph, in your broader work on poverty, what is the LHA gap meant for tenants and their quality of life?
Well, housing is the biggest cost that nearly all of us face. So issues around housing costs are, one of the biggest drivers of poverty, and the emergence of the LHA gap, this issue that we're talking about here, has a huge bearing on people, because if you haven't got the money, if you're having to dip in to other funds to cover your rent, you haven't got the money for your gas, you haven't got the money for your food, and it's absolutely a root cause of a lot of the problems that we're seeing around poverty in Wales, is that people don't have enough money to meet the housing costs and that they have to meet to find a home.
I suppose as well, you've got a dimension with discretionary housing payments. I should probably give some context to that. So discretionary housing payments are a set of temporary short-term emergency payments that are given to people who are in receipt of housing benefit or universal credit to help pay for certain costs that may accrue during their rental period. So, if they need to cover arrears, or if they need a deposit, or if they need, if they just have housing costs that they need to cover, oftentimes the DHP will help fill that gap. What we saw during last year is that DHPs, not only did the number of DHPs that were awarded increase, but also the value of each DHP was also up as well from previous years. Now, unfortunately, DHPs are going to be cut by nearly a third across the UK very shortly. That local authorities are going to have a very much diminished pot of funds to be able to support low-income tenants when they encounter some of these issues. So the problems that Stefan mentioned, where you have rising costs, much greater financial pressure, they're going to be made even worse so by this lack of a DHP, because local authorities are going to have to be much more frugal with how they issue DHPs. The amount of support that is on offer for people is going to be greatly diminished as we go forward into the next financial year.
Thanks for that, Hugh. One question I did have is that there's a focus on a specific demographic in your report, which is single adults under 35 with no dependents. Just to clarify this for the listeners, why was this specific group affected more than others?
Yeah, so the way that the system has been developed is that it's been deemed that if you're single and you're under 35, you don't need your own home. You are entitled to a shared accommodation, so a bedroom in another person's home. So I guess it comes from the model of student housing or kind of young professionals move into a city looking for somewhere to live. That's, you can see where the idea has come from. But what that means is that if you fit that criteria, you're only entitled to that shared accommodation rate. There just really isn't that rental market. It just doesn't really exist for people on low incomes to be able to find properties to share a room in. That is covered by the shared accommodation rate. So what often happens is that low income single people under 35 are forced to live in a one bed flat or something, or a one bed house by themselves. But their rent is only, is nowhere near enough then. So the problems that we've been talking about is even greater because the amount of benefit you get is that much less than even the insufficient level that you would be getting if you were getting the one bedroom allowance if you were a bit older.
I suppose there's also a particular problem with this age group in terms of what we heard from some local authorities as well was if they had a partner and a child with that partner and that couple separated, only one of them is actually entitled to a 2-bedroom house. The other one has to have a shared accommodation property. So it means that, if say you have a child at 20 and you need to be in shared accommodation applies up until you're 35. So you then have to try and juggle childcare up until when they're 15, all while trying to juggle it within shared accommodation, which obviously puts greater pressure on both parents and causes more issues further down the line. It's not just housing, it's not just cost, but there's a huge swathe of issues that are caused by this insufficient LHA.
To what extent is the root of this problem simply one of supply, whether it be private rental or social housing? To what extent would this problem be addressed if you just boosted provision?
I mean, certainly from the social housing point of view, it's difficult to fully quantify what the demand is for social housing, but certainly from our research and our estimates, the demand for social housing is way beyond what is actually allocated in stock. And certainly in our view, the private rental sector is definitely lacking in being able to provide sufficient provision for low-income renters, especially due to the issues with security. So certainly, if we could, massively increase the construction of social housing, and if we could also, look at more short-term methods of increasing social housing, such as maybe perhaps looking at modular housing or other means of quickly increasing stock, then we would probably see a potential decrease in the amount of problems that are faced by households. And certainly there's an issue with the LHA itself. So if you look at how many rental properties there are in Wales registered with Rent Smart Wales, it's around 200,000. Now, 30% of that would be 66,000, give or take. The numbers aren't precise that I'm quoting now. Now, there's roughly 80,000 people who are in receipt of housing benefit or the housing element of universal credit who live in the private rental sector. Even if you had the LHA at the 30th percentile, and even if the data was perfect, and even if it was absolutely spot on, you'd still have about 20,000 people who are still out of pocket and still facing the issues that we mentioned today. In the short term, you need to boost the LHA back to the 30th percentile, but you need to find adequate numbers of housing. Now, our recommendation is to try and increase social housing from that point of view and try and make sure that you have this secure, this safe, and this stable accommodation readily available for those people who require it. And so, yeah, I suppose, if we could increase the provision of social housing much quicker than we have done, it would go a long way to solve some of the problems that we've seen.
Yeah, just to add to that, I was going to say, I think, as you said, long-term social housing has to be the answer. It doesn't have LHA applied to it. There's a bedroom tax problem, but that's maybe a topic for another pod in its own right. But there's more support available. The rents are cheaper, though they are rising above inflation, or historically have been, which is another pod in its own right as well about what's going on with the way we're financing social housing at the moment. But that's where the answer is. But it's going to take decades at current rates for it to actually provide the answer. So there is a need for a serious conversation about how much are we putting into social housing. Could we, for example, look at devolving some of the housing benefit and the housing element of the universal credit budget, for example, so that we use some of that money to fund the supply we need. That's a longer term thing that we could look at, but it's a conversation that maybe we should be having. And also this question maybe about what do we do in the interim? So one of the things we've, kind of the big ticket items that we've seen talked about in the cooperation agreement is obviously around the idea of rent caps. That's something that we haven't looked in detail as part of this work. But I think one of the things that absolutely comes through this work is that if we're going to have that conversation, and that is going to play a part of the answer, the focus has to be at the bottom end of the market. The temptation around rent caps is to put up an example of outrageously high rent on a really crap looking flat somewhere in Cardiff, and how dare they charge this much for this. But the truth is that's kind of just so removed from the market. It's not really what's causing the problem. What's causing the problem for people on the lowest incomes is these lower income rents. So any conversation on rent caps we have, or any other kind of measure we think about increasing supply and affordability, needs to be focused at the bottom of the market and not just at the top, because otherwise we're not going to solve the problems that we've been talking about so far.
We'll come back to the cooperation agreement in a sec, Steph, don't worry. But I wanted to focus a little bit on the one of the calls you make in the report, which is the Welsh Home Guarantee. Would you be able to explain what this is and how it works you?
Yeah, so it's I suppose there'd be a package of measures to allow tenants, I suppose, a guarantee and security if they were faced eviction, and would give local authorities the tools in order to provide different a level of security, level of guarantee that they'll be able to have some degree of housing if they did face eviction. I suppose, Stefan, do you want to elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, I think kind of the core of the idea is that, at the moment, there's a lot of support in different places. So kind of bringing it into a one-stop shop, I think, is one of the key things that are put in it. And kind of giving more tools to local authorities when, so the guarantee we envisage being available for people who are in the homelessness system or who are at risk of falling into homelessness. So as he said, they've been issued with an eviction notice, for example. So as we've discussed, some of the challenges we see at the moment is around people don't have guarantors to enable them to move into a house. That's a problem for a lot of low-income renters. It's particularly acute for migrant groups, for example, if you don't have, if you haven't been in the UK long enough to be able to build that sort of network. And what we think is that by looking at creating that guarantee, the Welsh Government could work with local authorities to give them the tools to act as that guarantor, or to give that reference to people as well, so that it's giving them extra tools and bringing them together so that there's a kind of that more holistic package to help people into accommodation and giving people a chance, certainly as a starting point. Even if we can't resolve all the other problems kind of in the immediate term, at least it will help the people facing the greatest challenge.
Thanks, Steph. So the last time we talked to you was around the time of the cooperation agreement was being formed. You mentioned rent caps there. What other measures do you think that were in that agreement and are within the powers of the Welsh Government that could tackle some of the aspects of this crisis? You see things like the discussion about a Welsh national construction company. Perhaps the efforts in that could be put towards house building, for example. Is that kind of the action you'd like to see?
I think so. As with a lot of people, I think we're still awaiting detail on what quite a few of the stuff in the cooperation agreement actually means. But that's the sort of space where we'd like to see action. And I think in terms of what the Welsh Government can do to so let's assume that the UK government is not going to take action. And following today's spring statement, I think that's probably a fair bet for the next 12 months at least. So, let's think about what Welsh Government can do. So either can try and top up the rents, try and make up some of that gap itself, or it can try and regulate them in terms of kind of bring down rents, kind of in the short term. So in the original programme for government, we saw the Welsh Government talk about their leasing scheme, which was meant to bring more private sector landlords to work with Welsh Government. There's a need maybe to evaluate that to see how effectively that's working. Kind of seeing if we can put more money in, can we use that money more effectively to maybe provide more guarantees elsewhere rather than the upfront loans potentially, kind of as a short-term quick fix to get more people into housing. As we said, rent controls we've already touched on, kind of making sure that discussion focuses on people on the low income. So those are the kind of the two things, major tools it has in that regard. And then, as you said, supply is absolutely the other one. So, taking people out of the system. So if we're not going to get the system reformed at Westminster level, there's those measures we can take to make the system work less badly. And then there's kind of getting people outside the system entirely, and boosting supply, particularly in the social sector, is the way to do that.
So, Hugh, we've got local elections coming up in May. What do you think local authorities should be doing to address the housing crisis?
I suppose the big tool that local authorities have is the discretionary housing payment. Now, it has been cut, unfortunately, and it will limit local authorities' ability to provide support. But if you do look at the data, what you do find is that a lot of local authorities do not use their maximum allocation of the DHP in the first place. Blaenau Gwent and Anglesey are two particularly not great at using their DHP allocation. But there's only actually one, local authorities have the pot issued by the DWP, but they can also top up from their own funds. And so we've only actually seen one local authority, which is Torfaen, use the maximum allocation plus the maximum top up. And so that is one other way that the local Welsh Government can come in, and that's to ensure that local authorities have the amount of money sufficient to top up their DHP fund to the maximum. Yeah, another aspect I suppose Stefan also mentioned was, can they fill in as guarantors? Can they cover much more deposits to get people into housing in the first place? And we are seeing different schemes around different local authorities trying to experiment with some of these different mechanisms. It'd be exciting to see, what success they find. There needs to be more imagination in how they tackle things, and I think there's a lot that can be done going forward.
Yeah, and to build on what Hugh was saying there as well, I guess there's a practice element to this as well. So this is the sort of stuff that won't capture the headlines in any local authority election, but really makes a difference to people. So one of the things, for example, that we were interested in and had discussions about was the extension of the minimum eviction notice period to 6 months. Actually, essentially what's happening is that we've had a 2-year trial of that as a result of COVID, in a sense. And whilst that extension of a notice period could offer really huge benefits to people who are, kind of affected by the issues we've spoken about tonight, there's a risk if practice doesn't change, it won't be manifested in the best possible way. So we've heard of, for example, of local authorities where someone comes to them and says, right, I've just been issued with an eviction notice from my landlords, can you help me? And they just turn around and say, well, come back a month before you're evicted and then we'll help you at that point. So it's about changing that culture and also making sure that the resources are there as well, that local authorities have the resources, so that help begins on day one when that notice comes, because that maximises the possibility of you being able to find something more affordable and something suitable in the longer term for that tenant.
So, Steph, you mentioned today that we're doing this on the same day that we had the spring statement, as well as the rather worrying announcement that inflation has hit a 30-year high of over 6%. Were there any measures announced today that you think could actually make a real difference in alleviating poverty?
If I'm being frank, not really. I think particularly towards kind of the group that's most affected here. So, the increase in the national insurance threshold will make a difference to some workers. But, most low-income workers don't pay national insurance. So that's not going to help, the lowest paid workers. And it's certainly not going to help people who are on benefits, who don't work for various reasons or because they're unable to work. So it's not going to be of much help to people in that circumstances. A cut to fuel duty will help some, But for an awful lot of people, the help is going to disproportionately benefit those on the highest incomes rather than the lowest incomes. And there wasn't really anything in there. There's some discretionary pots of cash, which we will see a banner consequential from come to Wales, hopefully. But there wasn't really much in there in terms of kind of looking at the housing issues we've discussed tonight, and also kind of increase in benefits and pensions in line with inflation. So I think there wasn't an awful lot in there for the poorest people, the people who are going to be feeling the pinch more than most.
Yeah, for those who don't know, I mean, there was an announcement, wasn't there, that the benefits would be going up, was it 3.1% or something? And then inflation was announced at 6.2% this morning, and that was February's stats. That's before most of the worst impact we'll feel from the war in Ukraine. So it's going to be all eaten up by that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, because the benefit rate is set by inflation back in September, and obviously things have moved on an awful lot since then, and there was an opportunity today maybe to show a bit of flexibility and to react to that, but obviously that wasn't taken. So as you said, any increase is going to be more than eaten up by the added inflation that we're going to see over the coming months.
I just want to say thanks to both of you for coming on to talk to us this evening. The Bevan Foundation report, Wales Housing Crisis, Making the LHA Work for Wales, is out now, and we'll include it in the show notes for this episode. But if people want to hear more from you, where can they go to find you on Twitter, Hugh?
I don't use it nearly as much as I should do, but at Hugh Cocan, which is HUGHKOCAN, that's where you can find me on Twitter.
Great. Steph?
Yeah, and I'm at Steph H. Evans.
And the Bevan Foundation one, for those who don't know?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. That's at Bevan Foundation.
Steph. Thank you very much. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please do not forget to find us on Facebook and Twitter at HereIcePod, and on our brand new website, www.walespolitics.com. Thank you for listening to Here If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.